On the 25th of August, 1932, Edith Rockefeller McCormick died in a four-bedroom suite at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, bankrupt, owing more than $800,000. Through the window of that suite, she could see her own mansion across the street, shuttered and dark. She was the daughter of John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in American history. Over her lifetime, her father had given her more than $14 million. She was born into one of the largest fortunes in the country, married into a second, and died with nothing. Edith Rockefeller was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1872, the fourth child of the man who was building the largest private fortune the country had ever seen. Her father controlled the refining of American petroleum through Standard Oil, and by the time Edith was a young woman, the scale of what he held was almost beyond description. Standard Oil did not just drill for oil. It refined it, shipped it, priced it, and controlled almost every step between the wellhead and the lamp. The wealth it produced had no precedent in American life. There had been rich men before the Rockefellers. There had never been anyone like John D. Rockefeller. Edith grew up inside that fortune. She was not a distant cousin or a minor branch. She was one of his own children, raised in his household, taught his discipline, shaped by the gravity of his fortune from her earliest years. And the money that surrounded her was the real thing, not old and fading, but new and still compounding, fed every quarter by the earnings of the largest oil company in the world. By the time she reached adulthood, the Rockefeller fortune was the standard against which every other fortune in the country was measured. In 1895, when she was 23 years old, she married Harold Fowler McCormick. Harold was the son of Cyrus Hall McCormick, the man who invented the mechanical reaper and transformed American agriculture. Harold himself would go on to serve as chairman of International Harvester, one of the largest industrial companies in the world. The McCormick fortune was built on a machine that changed how the country fed itself, and it was enormous. The marriage joined two American dynasties, oil and reapers, Rockefeller and McCormick. It was a joining of American empires on a scale the country had seldom witnessed, and the young couple moved together to Chicago with a weight of money behind them, beyond nearly anything the country had seen. They settled in Herald City, where the McCormick name carried the same authority that the Rockefeller name carried in New York. Edith was 23 years old, a Rockefeller by birth, and a McCormick by marriage, the wife of the heir to one of its largest industrial companies. The scale of what they had between them was almost beyond the reach of arithmetic. Over the course of her lifetime, her father would give Edith more than $14 million in direct gifts, with a monthly allowance that ran to $5,000. This was a vast sum, enough to sustain a public life of any scope, in any city, for as long as she lived. But every dollar of it was gift money, written from her father's personal accounts. It was not held in a trust. It was not administered by a family office. No legal structure of any kind stood between Edith Rockefeller McCormick and the money her father gave her. What she chose to do with the fortune was up to her alone, and the sole protection it had was her own judgment. That would turn out to be the thing that mattered most. In Chicago, Edith built a household that matched the weight of the names she carried. She kept a rope of pearls valued at $2 million. She dined off Napoleon's own silver service, on a carpet that had once belonged to Peter the Great. The court furnishings of dead European monarchs filled her rooms, and every piece had been paid for with American oil money. She hosted dinners for 200 guests at a time, and no servant in the house was permitted to address her. Every word, every message, every request passed through her steward. She was the social dictator of Chicago. That was what a Rockefeller fortune looked like when someone chose to live inside it without restraint. The household consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in staff, furnishings, entertainments, and the upkeep of a life that never paused. And every dollar flowed in one direction. Nothing about the household generated a cent of revenue. Nothing about it was an investment. It was pure expenditure, magnificent and unrelenting, carried on the strength of a fortune that had no structural protection of any kind. There was no board of trustees watching the accounts, no investment manager tracking the drawdown. There was only Edith, the money her father had put in her hands, and the distance between them, which was nothing at all. The fortune sat in her personal accounts, and her personal accounts answered to no one but her. And the choices she began to make with that fortune were unlike anything anyone in the Rockefeller family had ever attempted. Her father had built a fortune by controlling an industry. Edith was about to spend one on a vision. In 1909, Edith helped found the Chicago Grand Opera Company, the organization that would bring grand opera to a city that had none. Over the years that followed, by Time magazine's accounting, she would spend $5 million keeping it alive. $5 million in the early 20th century was a fortune by itself. She did not write checks from the back of the room. She organized the company from the ground up, selected the artists, shaped the seasons, and covered the deficits out of her own accounts. Grand Opera in Chicago existed because Edith Rockefeller McCormick decided it would exist, and it survived year after year because she paid for it to survive. This was the pattern that would define everything she touched. She believed in something, and she put her fortune behind it without reservation, expecting nothing in return except the thing itself. Grand Opera was not a hobby. It was a cause, funded the way her father had funded the University of Chicago as a personal mission backed by personal wealth. But her father could afford his philanthropy because Standard Oil was still feeding the fortune every quarter. What Edith spent came from a pool that received nothing new after the check was signed. There was no revenue stream behind her. There was no business feeding the account. The money was a pool, and she was drawing from it, and nothing was filling it back up. The $5 million on opera was money that would never come back. Once spent, it was gone, and nothing was generating more to replace it. And the opera could not survive without her. It did not generate the revenue to sustain itself. It lived because she fed it, and the day she could no longer feed it, it would die. That dependence did not trouble her. She believed in the opera the way her father believed in Standard Oil, as something worth building, regardless of what it cost. But Standard Oil generated revenue every quarter, and the opera consumed money without producing a cent. That was the nature of every venture Edith Rockefeller McCormick would undertake from this point forward. Grand, vital in her own eyes, built on her personal fortune, and sustained by nothing except the ongoing willingness of a single person to keep writing checks. But Grand Opera was only the beginning. In 1913, 4 years after founding the opera company, Edith went further than anyone around her could have predicted. She traveled to Zurich, Switzerland, to be treated by Carl Jung. She was 41 years old. She was among the wealthiest women in the world, and something inside her that the pearls and the silver and the dinners for 200 could not reach had broken. What Jung diagnosed, per Chernow's account, was latent schizophrenia. She would stay 8 years. For the better part of a decade, Edith Rockefeller McCormick, the woman who had dined 200 guests off Napoleon's silver in Chicago, the former social dictator of the city, lived in a single hotel in Zurich, Switzerland. The treatment consumed her days, her attention, and her money. After 8 years of intensive analysis, she still could not ride a train for more than 20 minutes without being overcome by fear. The woman who had commanded the social calendar of Chicago could not bring herself to cross the city of Zurich by rail. And yet, inside the walls of that hotel, she became something no one in the Rockefeller family had ever been. She trained as a Jungian analyst herself, took on more than 50 patients of her own, and claimed to have heard 12,000 dreams in a single year. And yet she could not leave the hotel for an afternoon, and she was running one of the busiest analytic practices in Jung's circle. The contradiction of her life in Zurich was total. A railway car overwhelmed her in 20 minutes, and yet she could sit across from a patient for hours, listening to a stranger describe dreams that she believed held the architecture of the unconscious. She organized her practice with the same precision she had brought to the Chicago household, keeping records, building a method, treating the analytic work with the same weight her father gave to petroleum. But the analytic practice did not produce income. It produced conviction, and conviction, in the years to come, would prove to be the most expensive thing she owned. She paid $120,000 to build and house Jung's Zurich Psychology Club, and in 1918 and 1919, she funded James Joyce, paying him 1,000 Swiss francs a month so that he could finish writing Ulysses. A Rockefeller, sitting in a Zurich hotel she could barely leave, was bankrolling one of the defining novels of the 20th century while the novelist worked in another room in the same city. The cost of the Zurich years was enormous, and it went far beyond the analysis and the patronage. For 8 years, Edith maintained a full household in a Swiss hotel while another household ran in Chicago without her. Month after month, year after year, the money flowed out of the accounts her father had filled across the Atlantic into a world of dreams and analytic practice, and nothing came back. Grand Opera had already cost $5 million. Zurich was adding a cost that no single figure could capture, because what she was spending in Zurich was not only money, it was the years in which she might have built something that could sustain itself, and instead she built a practice that depended on the fortune underneath it and nothing else, a fortune she had never thought to protect. When she returned to Chicago after 8 years abroad, she came back changed. The Zurich years had not weakened her certainty. They had hardened it. She had trusted her own judgment with 50 patients and 12,000 dreams, and the judgment had held, at least inside the walls of the hotel where she practiced. She came back to Chicago believing she understood forces that others could not see, and that her understanding gave her the authority to act on them. For 8 years, she had lived inside the world of the unconscious. Now she was going to apply that same conviction to the physical world, to land and property, and the family fortune itself. But she was not coming back to the same life she had left. In 1921, Harold McCormick divorced her. Per Chernow's account, Edith received no alimony, and she had to pay him $2,700,000 for his share of their houses. The marriage that had joined two dynasties ended with Edith writing a check for close to $3 million and receiving nothing in return. The divorce was not the only loss. She had already sunk $340,000 into a failed scheme to harden wood, a venture that produced nothing and returned nothing. And by 1920, before the divorce was even final, her debts had already run past $800,000. The numbers were moving in a direction that no amount of monthly allowance could reverse. Before the great venture that would destroy what remained of her fortune, the financial cushion that should have protected Edith Rockefeller McCormick from a single bad decision was already gone, and no one had built anything to replace it. The arithmetic was closing in. $14 million from her father, given over a lifetime, $5 million on Grand Opera, 8 years of spending in Zurich, $2,700,000 to settle the divorce, $340,000 on a failed wood venture, hundreds of thousands a year on the household. The outflow had never stopped, and there was no machine on the other side generating more. Her father's allowance was still arriving, $5,000 a month, and larger gifts when she asked. But the principal was shrinking, the debts were growing, and there was nothing structural in the way her fortune was held that could slow either one. No trust, no professional oversight. Just her name on the accounts, the same as it had always been. And into this moment, with the cushions stripped and the debts already mounting, Edith Rockefeller McCormick decided to do the most ambitious and the most dangerous thing she had ever done with her money. In 1923, in the wave of public fascination that followed the opening of Tutankhamen's tomb in Egypt, Edith announced to the newspapers that she was the reincarnation of the pharaoh's wife. She told reporters, "I married King Tutankhamen when I was only 16 years old." She studied astrology. She kept Christmas on the 15th of December, more than a week before anyone else in the city. The press printed it all, and the public image of Edith Rockefeller McCormick shifted further into something the society columns could not credit. But the eccentricity, however strange it appeared, was not the point of the story. The judgment was. This was the person whose signature was about to go on $11 million in guaranteed debt. She had spent $5 million on opera and kept it alive. 8 years in Zurich with Jung had produced a practice of her own. Close to $3 million had gone to settle a divorce, and the world had not ended. Every time she had bet on her own judgment, the money had covered the bet. Nothing had ever stopped her. No number had ever come back unpaid. And so she moved forward to the largest bet of all. Back in Chicago, Edith built a real estate empire. In 1923, she organized her own trust and capitalized it with more than $5,200,000 of her Standard Oil securities, the productive, income-generating core of everything her father had ever given her. She put the stock that paid her bills into a speculative venture. Her agents began selling property on the north side of Chicago, and over the years that followed, they would move more than 16,000 lots across the city. The operation was ambitious, and for a time it worked. Chicago was growing, the North Side was developing, and the lots were selling. Edith saw what her father and every great American fortune builder had understood: that land in a growing city appreciates, and that buying it before the growth arrives is one of the oldest ways to multiply wealth. But her father had built Standard Oil to generate the cash that bought the land. He never exposed the company itself to cover a bet. Edith was using her father's gifts as the capital, staking the productive core of her fortune on a venture that depended on a single market in a single city. And she was about to go further. She was about to guarantee the entire operation with nothing but her own name. In 1929, she raised the stakes higher than any single member of the Rockefeller family had ever risked. She issued $11 million in gold notes to finance the real estate empire. The notes were sold to ordinary small investors across Chicago in $1,000 pieces. They were advertised, per Time magazine's 1929 report, as having almost governmental safety. And every one of those notes carried an unconditional guarantee from Edith Rockefeller McCormick, not from a corporation or a trust, but from her, in her own name, with her fortune on the line. Her father saw what was coming. "Perchance now," the old man wrote to her, "I shall expect later on that you will have great disappointment in connection with these real estate transactions." The old man had spent his entire adult life building a fortune from nothing on the principle that the core of the wealth is never exposed to a single bet. And he watched his own daughter do the one thing he had never done in 60 years of business: put the core of the fortune up as collateral for a speculative venture and guarantee it with nothing but her signature. He could see the risk as clear as daylight, and he could do nothing about it, because there was no structure between her and the money. It was hers, and the decisions were hers, and no trust or office or manager stood in the way. The small investors who bought those notes believed they were buying the Rockefeller name. They believed that a guarantee from the daughter of John D. Rockefeller was as safe as a government bond. They did not know that the woman behind the name was already deep in debt, nor did they know that the Standard Oil stock backing the trust had been drawn down by decades of opera, Zurich, a divorce, and a household that consumed hundreds of thousands a year. They knew what the advertisements told them: almost governmental safety. They were about to discover what a personal guarantee is worth when there is nothing underneath it. And then the crash came, and it came for everything. In October of 1929, the stock market collapsed, and the economy of the United States began the longest contraction in its history. In Chicago, the real estate market that had been absorbing Edith's 16,000 lots froze solid. The lots stopped selling, and the properties that were supposed to generate the revenue to service the $11 million guarantee produced nothing. Buyers vanished, credit froze, and the North Side lots that had been selling for good prices a year earlier now sat unsold month after month, while the notes that financed them came closer to maturity. The land was still there, acre after acre across the North Side, but land without buyers is not wealth, it is weight. And the weight of the guarantee was about to crush everything beneath it. The $11 million in gold notes with Edith Rockefeller McCormick's name on them came due, and she honored them. Per Time magazine's account of her final years, she sold $18 million of her Standard Oil securities on a falling market to make the small note holders whole. $18 million. That was the productive core of everything her father had given her, the one asset that had been generating income for more than 30 years, the stock that had paid for the opera and the household and Zurich and the divorce settlement and the real estate venture itself. The stock went on a market that was falling day by day, at prices that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, to cover a debt she had guaranteed with nothing but her own signature. She did not have to honor the guarantee. Walking away was possible, but she chose to pay, and the cost of paying was everything she had. And the arithmetic of the fortune, traced from beginning to end, tells the whole story. The full sum of her father's gifts, given over a lifetime: $5 million spent on grand opera, $2,700,000 to settle the divorce, more than $5 million put into the real estate trust, $11 million guaranteed with her name. And when the guarantee came due, $18 million in securities sold on a falling market to cover it. The numbers leave nothing. They never could have. In 1931, Unable to get more money from her father, Edith had Cartier sell her jewels. The $2 million rope of pearls, the pieces she had worn at those dinners for 200, in the household where no servant could address her, on the carpet that had belonged to Peter the Great, all of it went to the auction house. And still it was not enough. There was something honorable in what she had done. She had not walked away from the small investors. Instead of declaring bankruptcy to protect what remained, she sold the stock, absorbed the loss, and made the note holders whole with her own fortune. But the cost of that honor was everything. The fortune that had funded the opera, sustained 8 years of analysis in Zurich, settled the divorce, and built the real estate empire was consumed by the guarantee. Every dollar her father had given her was gone, and the debts remained. In June of 1932, with nothing left, Edith Rockefeller McCormick moved into a 4-bedroom suite at the Drake Hotel on the near north side of Chicago. It was the last place she would ever live. The Drake was a luxury hotel, and the suite had 4 bedrooms and a view of the lakefront and the Gold Coast of Chicago. But a hotel suite is a rented room, and Edith Rockefeller McCormick had spent 30 years in a world that answered to no one but her. Through the windows of that suite, she could look across the street and see her own mansion, the house where she had once held court with Napoleon's silver on the table and Peter the Great's carpet under her feet. The mansion was shuttered and dark, and it had been dark for months. She could no longer afford to heat it, staff it, or live in it. Napoleon's silver was gone. The carpet was gone. The pearls were gone. And the woman who had been the social dictator of Chicago was living in a rented suite across the street from the house that had once held all of it, separated from her former life by the width of a single road. She had been born a Rockefeller and married a McCormick. She had spent $5 million on grand opera, funded Carl Jung's psychology club, bankrolled James Joyce while he wrote Ulysses, and built a real estate empire with 16,000 lots across the north side. And now she was living in a hotel room, looking at her own shuttered house, with debts she could not pay and no money left to try. On the 25th of August, 1932, 6 days before her 60th birthday, Edith Rockefeller McCormick died. The people at her bedside were Harold McCormick, the ex-husband who had divorced her and left for an opera singer, her 3 surviving children, and her brother John. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, was 93 years old and too frail to make the trip. He would outlive his daughter by nearly 5 years. Outside the Drake, about 2,000 people gathered in the street to mark the passing of a Rockefeller who had once commanded the social life of the city and now left it owing more than she had. She died bankrupt, the debts still unpaid. Born a Rockefeller, she left the world unable to pay what she owed, and she died carrying the most recognized name in American wealth. And the name had not saved her. It had not slowed the spending, blocked the guarantee, or protected a single dollar. Because the name was never what held the fortune together. A trust could have held the money in place. Any family office could have flagged the risk. A legal wall between the fortune and the person who spent it could have stopped the guarantee before it was signed. But Edith had none of those things, and in the end, the name was just a signature on a guarantee that consumed everything it was supposed to protect. The mechanism that destroyed her fortune was not the crash of 1929, though the crash pulled the trigger. Per Time magazine's reporting, the mechanism was uncovered leverage. The Standard Oil stock her father had given her was never locked in a trust or administered by a family office. It sat in her personal accounts, and she used it as collateral for a speculative venture she guaranteed with her own name. She capitalized a real estate trust with more than $5 million of that stock, the income-producing heart of everything she owned. Then she raised $11 million in gold notes and guaranteed them with her signature. Her entire fortune was concentrated in 2 assets at the same time: volatile stock and illiquid Chicago real estate, and the 2 were not hedged against each other. They were stacked on top of each other, held together by her personal guarantee. When the real estate froze, the only way to honor the guarantee was to sell the stock. And when the stock was gone, there was nothing left. There was no trust to catch the fall, no family office to flag the concentration, no professional manager who could have looked at the numbers and told her that guaranteeing $11 million with assets already tied up in the same venture was the kind of bet that destroys fortunes. There was only Edith Rockefeller McCormick, her conviction, and her signature. A Rockefeller had built her financial life on the one thing the Rockefellers are known for never doing: an unprotected personal guarantee backed by nothing structural at all. Set her beside her brother, and the architecture of what happened becomes impossible to miss. John D. Rockefeller Jr. received the bulk of their father's fortune, a sum far larger than what Edith had been given over the course of her life, and he did the exact opposite of what his sister did with hers. In 1934, 2 years after Edith died bankrupt at the Drake, her brother locked the family money into the first of the great, irrevocable Rockefeller dynasty trusts. Per the records of the Rockefeller family trusts, these were instruments designed to do one thing above all: prevent any single heir from doing what Edith had done. The trusts were managed by professional lawyers and investment officers who answered to the terms of the trust documents, not to the wishes of any single heir. The trusts paid out income to the family for support and maintenance, enough to live well, but no heir could touch the principal. No heir could pledge it as collateral. No heir could borrow against it. And no heir, no matter how certain, no matter how convinced of a vision, could put a personal guarantee on a debt with the family fortune behind it. The one act that had destroyed Edith's wealth was the one act the trusts were designed to make impossible. And he ran the entire operation through a single family office, room 5600, on the 56th floor of Rockefeller Plaza in Manhattan. It was not a name on a door. It was a full professional operation staffed with lawyers, investment managers, and administrators whose job was to manage the Rockefeller fortune the way a corporation manages its assets. The office oversaw the trusts, tracked the investments, monitored the distributions, and held the family's wealth at a professional distance from the decisions of any individual heir. It was the structure that Edith had never had. It was the wall between judgment and money that she had never built. The structure held. 6 generations later, per the records of the Rockefeller family trusts, the Rockefeller fortune is still intact, some $8.4 billion spread across more than 170 heirs. The money has survived the Great Depression, the Second World War, recessions, tax reforms, and 6 generations of heirs who might have spent it, pledged it, guaranteed it, or put it into ventures that could not pay for themselves. It survived because the trusts held. No single person was permitted to use the fortune as collateral, and no signature could pledge the principal. Not even conviction, no matter how strong, could reach the core of the wealth. The wall that Edith never built was the wall that saved everything her brother touched. Edith Rockefeller McCormick received more than $14 million from the very same father. She died in a hotel room across the street from her own shuttered mansion, Bankrupt, owing more than $800,000. Her brother received far more, and 6 generations later, the money is still there. The difference between the sister who died broke and the brother whose fortune outlived them both by a century was not the name they shared. It was the structure only one of them built.